Hello, and welcome to another edition of What's Going On, a new segment in which myself, SD Wickett, and Michael Curzon discuss stories that don't quite make it to press. Today we're here to discuss the underhand tactics used by various Western governments to ensure maximum vaccine uptake. Michael, you've been writing about the ways in which the government has been going after those who don't wish to take this vaccine. You pointed out that it's ministers to blame for the extension of lockdowns and not people who aren't taking the vaccine. So, Michael, what's going on?
Well, what's going on, first of all, is that this was a series we discussed sort of quite, how do you put it, off the press yesterday. Very randomly decided we'd do maybe a few times a week. And already we're on the second day and it's the second episode. We can't help ourselves, because it gets more and more ridiculous as the days goes on. So the latest COVID scare story, as everybody listening will know, is the Indian variant. And whilst the business secretary said today that we shouldn't stigmatize those who don't want to take the vaccine because that's only going to make matters worse, another minister ignored that rule and told Politico, quote, "The risk is that a small number of unvaccinated idiots ruin it for everybody else." So the
Hmm.
idea basically is that the Indian variant, which, as Matt Hancock said on Sunday, can spread like wildfire among those who are unvaccinated, could essentially extend lockdown or see lockdown being extended. Even Boris Johnson last Sunday confirmed that, quote, "nothing," end quote, "is ruled out in responding to the variant." But of course, it's not the government's fault that lockdown is to be extended. It's those people who refuse the vaccine who are to be blamed, according to the government's rhetoric. But what the government seems to forget is that 20 million people, more than 20 million, of course, by this point, have now been fully vaccinated against COVID in this country. And I think about 36 million, nearly 40 million, have received at least one dose. And it's important to note, just quickly, to get the boring bit out of the way, shall I say, that the vaccine has been shown, and there's nothing yet to suggest otherwise, to work against this and other variants. I mean, people will straight away say, "Well, you're no doctor," so I'll quote from somebody else. So, Oxford professor of theoretical epidemiology, Sunetra Gupta, said last week that the vaccines do work against the Indian variant in terms of delivering immunity against severe disease and infection. So, what a lot of the fear is about at the minute is that cases are increasing. But essentially, what Professor Gupta says is that increasing cases doesn't matter, because what the vaccine protects against is people dying. She says whether or not infections go up with new variants is not relevant. It's important that people don't die. And what the vaccines do is protect, as I say, against severe disease, severe infection. So why is it that the scare story is carrying on? All of the vulnerable people, at least those who wanted to be, have been vaccinated. Vaccines work against the variants, and yet we're still hearing that because some people don't want the vaccine, lockdown is to be or could be extended. So
Hmm.
going to the title of the series, what is going on?
What is going on? I'm at a loss for words. We were chatting for about 5-10 minutes before we hit record, and I was getting quite worked up about this because it's just it's wide scale mental abuse on a level not seen before. It's everywhere you look. It's and so just to draw some attention to some of my own data. The UK currently has the highest rate of combined vaccine take up and willing to take up the vaccine at about 90%, which, as we know, is more than enough to trigger herd immunity and to have cases falling exponentially. Right.
Especially when combined with people having the vaccine and developing antibodies. I mean,
The
it's
virus.
supposed to be 70%. Exactly, the virus, sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. So the vaccine levels combined with people who have had the virus are well above what is generally accepted as being herd immunity.
Hmm. I'm I'm in the latter stat. I had a positive test about a year ago actually. Didn't feel a thing. Recovered antibodies, the whole shebang bang. But that's not enough. That's not enough. Is that you have to sign up for this, and it's yeah, it's worrying, and it isn't just the British government who have been making some rather ominous statements. It's also been across the pond in the US, where so many of the social trends that are ripping society apart have been imported from. This week we saw both President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris tweet out something which I can only describe. It's like it's been ripped straight out of a dystopian fiction.
Yeah.
It's take this jab or wear a mask until you do, which is a horrifying thought. Is that that is the supposed leader of the free world saying that his citizenry, all 300 million of them, are not free anymore. They don't have a choice in the matter. They either have to subjugate and humiliate themselves by covering their faces everywhere they go, or take a jab that they don't necessarily want. Like, that's not on for what is supposed to be a modern Western free democracy.
Yeah, and of course the British government has taken it one step further by insinuating take the vaccine or forever remain in lockdown. And I think in terms of the fear campaign and the blame game in this, it gets really quite serious, because they're not only saying that lockdown will continue, but that lockdown will be your fault. If you don't take the vaccine, it's your fault. That not only you, but your friends, your loved ones who have all been good enough to take the vaccine and who all now very much disapprove of your refusenik, as they say, attitudes, will be blaming you for not taking the vaccine for why lockdown isn't being eased. And of course, it's ministers' fault, because there's no reason from this point that the lockdown can't be ended. I mean, you could argue that was the case long ago, but even just standing at this point right now, lockdown, especially because of the impact which carrying on with lockdown also has on the economy, on people's mental and physical health. I mean, we always talk about the mental health in terms of COVID, but of course the physical health, since that contrasts directly against COVID, is often ignored. The other C, cancer, which has been widely ignored throughout this whole process. The Professor Carol Sikora, who's I believe is called the positive professor in the Express, who writes often on this and says, why hasn't there been, and this demonstrates the government's attitude on COVID, why hasn't there been a single press conference on the other diseases which have been ignored over the past year? Why haven't we had one press conference out of the great swathe of COVID press conferences that we've had, where we've had the graphs of deaths, infections, and being explained to us why lockdowns need to be imposed again and again and again? Why have we never had anything, say, on cancer? The NHS, the government, completely focused solely on COVID, and that's really taking its toll, which further demonstrates the need to break away from this narrative of the Indian variant, which, when people are vaccinated, doesn't harm them. And of course, if people aren't vulnerable, then they're not vulnerable to it anyway.
Yes. Going back to your point about the sort of the punitive punishment of we're all going back to lockdown because of 5-10% of the population. It's like that bit in Full Metal Jacket when Private Pile, they find food on him and they make the rest of them do push-ups. They punish the rest of them and make the wrongdoer watch. This is what you've done. This is what you've done to your fellow Brits. This is what you've done to your compatriots. It's a really ugly game the government are playing, and it's it's gone so far beyond a paternalistic, benevolent response to a virus. This is just wide-scale mental abuse, and it can't be allowed to continue. But obviously, it will, because the majority of people have swallowed the government line to the point where any questions asked whatsoever is met immediately with attack. It's like the public have turned into white blood cells. As soon as any sort of threat to the system enters the body, it goes straight on the attack. It's getting to the point where they probably don't even soon they won't even need cops to enforce the stuff. The public will just like gang up and take down people hesitant to get vaccinated, vigilante style. It's an ugly game the government is playing, and I at this point I see no end in sight. I mean, I foolishly believed, as I did, a year ago, as I did 14 months ago, that come June 21st, this was going to actually be in the rearview mirror. But now I hold very little optimism that June 21st is going to be any sort of freedom day.
Well, it struck me that this language around the Indian variant and around people not taking the vaccine has come at a time when talk about vaccine passports has ceased to exist. Now, as you know, I'm having to read through all the papers, sift through emails that people send about lockdown and COVID, and talking to people throughout the day for reporting with lockdown skeptics, constantly looking at this stuff. So I can generally tell what is and isn't being talked about. And for a long time, it was vaccine passports every single day, really hammering down vaccine passports here, vaccine passports there. You're going to need it to, walk your dog soon, was some people were being scared of. Vaccine passports have been out of the media, as far as I can tell, at least, for at least a week and a half. At the same time, the narrative around the Indian variant and lockdown will be extended if you don't get vaccinated has been appearing. And it strikes me that this, the change in narrative comes after a number of findings that essentially forcing people to get vaccinated through vaccine passports doesn't work. And I'll go through a few of them that I've reported on lockdown skeptics in the last few weeks. So one of them, a study which hasn't yet been peer reviewed, but was led by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, found that health and social care workers who feel greater pressure from their employers to receive vaccination are more likely to decline it. So if you try and force people to get vaccinated, they're going to be less likely to want to take it. Another study in the US this time found that 80%, nearly 80% of those who don't want a COVID vaccine will never change their minds. So again, try and force people to get vaccinated, not going to change their minds. If anything, it might make them more anti-vaccine, as they say. And the last one, and I think the most interesting, actually, the closest to the government, should we say, is that even a member of SAGE said over last week or the week before that the introduction of vaccine passports could lead to people refusing to get vaccinated against COVID. So these three findings, and these aren't the only findings, but these are three which are the most pertinent, I think. These three findings have shown with great clout that I sounded like Nick Clegg then, that if you try and force people to get vaccinated, they won't buckle. If anything, it might make them less likely. So having realized that, it might be that the government is pushing away that narrative. Okay, let's not talk about vaccine passports anymore. And by the way, they've reeled it back from pubs, theatres, cinemas, cafes, restaurants, etc., etc. No longer going to be needed there, apparently. Instead, the narrative is, which I think is more compelling, and it doesn't sound as much like they're trying to force you, but that at the end of the day is what they're doing, by saying, if you don't get vaccinated, as we've said a number of times in the episode, lockdown will be extended, and that's your fault. So I think that's the interesting narrative change. And I want to mention something, Sam, because you had a good point on this before we started recording, which is that one of the lines in the Mail today, which has been taken from one minister or another, is that ideas are being considered, being drawn up for extending lockdown, not only because people aren't getting vaccinated and that's going to ruin it for everybody else, but directly to, as Mel put it, to protect the unvaccinated, as if, as you said earlier, it's some paternalistic thing. But you had a good point on that before we recorded, which I thought you might want to mention again.
Yes, I've mentioned in the past on the weekend reviews that we've seemingly ceased to become a country. We become a virus response with a nation attached to the hip. I don't buy for a second the line that this is done to protect us, because of all the things to protect us from, this is probably somewhere down in the middle of the list of concern. Protect us from a virus that's taken because we know the death toll is inflated because of the way they collect death data, but let's just say, for argument's sake, 100,000 people have died, right? That's an awful tragedy, but compare that to 65 million people have had the joy of life ripped away from them. That those two numbers are not even remotely comparable, right? Protect us from this virus with at best a 2% mortality rate, but not from missed cancer diagnosis, which cancer, if it spreads, has a far higher rate of fatality. Or what about people from committing suicide because they've lost everything? They've lost their home, they've lost their business, they've lost their loved ones, they've lost their social life, they've lost the spontaneity and just the joy of life. You know, we aren't being protected; we're being herded.
Mm, absolutely. I think that's a good point to end on.
Mm, mm.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is what's going on.
Well, that's the tip of the iceberg of what's going on.
Yeah, well, absolutely. No,
We'll be back next time something's going on.
probably tomorrow.
Yeah, possibly. It never ends. From Michael Curzon and myself, thank you and good night.